The wind had a voice in the high country, a lonesome sound that sang through the lodgepole pines and scraped against granite peaks. Samuel Hawkins knew its every temper, from the whisper that promised a fair dawn to the shriek that warned of a coming blizzard. For 8 years, that voice had been his most constant companion, a sound more familiar than a human's. But as he rode down the switchbacks into the valley, the wind changed its tune. It carried new smells, coal smoke, frying bacon, the damp rot of fresh-cut lumber, and it spoke of a world he had long ago abandoned. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Silas, picked its way down the last rocky incline and onto the muddy track that served as the main artery for the town of Dust Creek. The place had grown. New buildings, raw and unpainted, shouldered their way between the older, weathered structures. Sam remembered. A half-finished railroad trestle loomed like a great wooden skeleton at the valley's edge, a promise of progress that felt more like a threat. The world was shrinking, its iron tendrils reaching even into these remote corners of Colorado, squeezing out the quiet and the wildness. Sam felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He was a relic, a man who lived by the seasons and the habits of beaver, and he had no place in this new age of steam and telegraphs. He swung down from Silas in front of the general store, his worn buckskins a stark contrast to the wool coats and calico dresses of the townsfolk. He moved with a quiet economy of motion learned from years of solitude, his eyes scanning everything, trusting nothing. A bundle of prime beaver and marten pelts, the result of a long and bitter winter, was slung over his shoulder. His plan was simple, unchanged from every other time he'd been forced to come down from the mountain trade, the furs for salt, flour, coffee, and ammunition. Then he would melt back into the pines, back to the silence where he belonged. Inside, the store was a chaos of noise and smells. Men crowded the counter, their talk a loud mix of gold strikes, railroad wages, and politics. Sam waited his turn, standing apart from the others, his gaze distant. He felt their curious glances, heard their muttered speculations. The mountain man, the trapper, a ghost from a dying era. He didn't mind. He preferred it. Anonymity was a kind of freedom. It was the guilt that had driven him to the mountains, a guilt as vast and silent as the snow-choked canyons he called home. He carried the memory of his brother, Daniel, like a stone in his heart. He could still see it as clear as the winter sky, the two of them on that hunt. The massive grizzly rising from the brush, the crack of his own rifle echoing a fraction too late. He remembered the look of surprise on Daniel's face, a look that had haunted every waking moment and stalked his dreams for 12 long years. The townsfolk back in Missouri had blamed him, their whispers following him like carrion crows. He hadn't argued. He blamed himself more than they ever could. So he had run, leaving behind everything, including the one person who had ever looked at him as if he were not already broken. Quite a day for Dust Creek. The storekeeper, a portly man named Henderson, said as he weighed Sam's furs, "The whole town's turned out for the wedding." Sam grunted, his eyes on the scales. "Don't have much use for weddings." "Oh, you would for this one." Henderson chuckled, making a note in his ledger. "Not every day Thomas Carter takes a wife. Richest man in the county. They say, bought himself a pretty little thing from back east. A real lady." Sam gathered his supplies, his mind already turning back toward the trail. The affairs of men like Thomas Carter were a world away from his own. He knew the type men who measured their worth in land claims and gold dust. Men who saw the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be plundered. He paid for his goods, the weight of the coins feeling unnatural in his palm after so long dealing only in the currency of fur and meat. He was loading the salt and flour onto his pack mule when the church bell began to peal, a loud, insistent clang that sent a flutter of pigeons into the gray sky. A crowd was gathering on the boardwalk across the street, their faces turned toward the steepled white building at the end of the road. Sam ignored them, tightening the last of the knots with practiced efficiency. He was ready. The pines were calling to him, promising the cold, clean solace of solitude. He put a foot in his stirrup, ready to swing up and leave this noisy, crowded world behind for another season. That was when the church doors opened. A man and a woman stepped out into the weak afternoon light, silhouetted against the dim interior. The man was tall and broad, dressed in a fine black suit. Thomas Carter, Sam presumed. The woman at his side was a vision in white, her face obscured by a lace veil. The crowd cheered, and a few enterprising boys threw handfuls of rice. Sam felt a pang of impatience. He was tired of this town, of its people and its celebrations. He wanted the familiar scent of pine and the cold, sharp air of the high peaks. He watched, waiting for the throng to disperse so he could pass. The bride took her husband's arm, and they began to descend the church steps. A sudden gust of wind, a true mountain wind, swept down the street, catching the bride's veil and whipping it back from her face. And time stopped. The noise of the crowd, the pealing of the bell, the restless stamping of his horse, it all faded into a deep and profound silence. The world narrowed to a single point, the woman's face. It was a face he knew better than his own, a face he had traced in his mind 1,000 times by the light of a lonely campfire. It was older, etched with a sadness he did not recognize. The soft lines of girlhood replaced by the elegant, weary grace of a woman. But there was no mistaking the deep blue of her eyes, or the stubborn set of her chin. Eliza Turner. The name was a punch to the gut, stealing the air from his lungs. It couldn't be. Eliza was a ghost, a memory locked away with Daniel and the life he had fled in Missouri. She was a world away. Yet here she was, standing in the muddy street of Dust Creek, Colorado, on the arm of another man. His man. His heart hammered against his ribs. A wild, trapped thing. He felt a dizzying rush, as if the mountain itself had shifted beneath his feet. He saw her glance move over the crowd, a polite, distant smile on her lips. Then her eyes found him. The smile faltered. Her steps slowed. He saw the flicker of disbelief in her gaze, the sudden, sharp intake of breath. For a heartbeat. They were the only two people in the world, bound by a chasm of 12 silent years. Thomas Carter, her new husband, said something to her, his voice a low rumble, but she didn't seem to hear. She gently pulled her arm from his, her eyes never leaving Sam's. Snow had begun to fall, thick, wet flakes that clung to her hair and melted on her pale cheeks. She started toward him, her white dress dragging in the slushy mud. The crowd murmured, parting before her as if she were a spirit. She walked through the space they made, her gaze locked with his, closing the impossible distance between them. Carter took a step to follow, a look of thunderous confusion on his face, but one of her bridesmaids laid a hand on his arm, whispering something that made him pause. Eliza stopped a foot from him, so close he could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, the same ones he had once counted on a summer afternoon by the river. Her lips trembled, and her eyes, those impossible blue eyes, searched his face, looking for the boy he had been. The world held its breath. The wind swirled around them, carrying the scent of snow and a sorrow so profound it felt ancient. He could not move, could not speak. He was frozen in time, a man of stone rooted to the muddy earth. She leaned in, and her voice was a bare whisper, a sound meant only for him, lost to the wind and the crowd, but as clear to his soul as a rifle shot. "You don't remember me, do you?" whispered the bride. Her gaze held his, a sea of unspoken history. "I was the girl you left behind, mountain man." He stood there, mute and shaking, as the falling snow began to cover her shoulders like a shroud. The wind howled through the skeletal frame of the new railroad, and it sounded like a judgment, a final, damning verdict on the man who had run so far only to find that his past had been waiting for him all along. Her words hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across a dozen years of silence. For a long moment, Samuel could only stare, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and memory. The face before him was Eliza's. Yet not. The Missouri sun and youthful dreams had been replaced by a shadow, a deep-seated weariness in her eyes that spoke of sorrows he couldn't imagine. Before he could find his voice, a heavy hand fell on her shoulder. Thomas Carter stood beside her, his presence as solid and imposing as a block of granite. His handsome face was a mask of strained civility, but his eyes were chips of ice. He smiled, a tight, possessive gesture that did not reach his eyes. "My dear," he said, his voice a low, proprietary murmur that was somehow louder than the crowd's whispers. "You mustn't dawdle in the cold. We have guests waiting." He looked at Sam then, a dismissive glance that took in the worn buckskins, the unshaven jaw, the wildness of a man too long away from civilization. He saw not a person, but an obstacle, a piece of mud on his wife's perfect white dress. Eliza flinched slightly at his touch, but did not pull away. She gave Sam one last, fleeting look, a look of pleading, of warning, of a despair so profound it struck him to the core. Then she turned, allowing Carter to guide her back toward the waiting carriage. Her posture suddenly rigid, her head held high. The crowd, sensing the private drama had ended, began to buzz with renewed excitement, their attention shifting to the wealthy groom and his beautiful bride. Sam stood rooted to the spot, the pelts on his shoulder feeling impossibly heavy. He watched the carriage door close, watched it pull away, its wheels churning the snowy mud. He was left alone in the street, the falling snow quickly covering the tracks, erasing the moment as if it had never happened. But it had. He felt it branded onto him, the ghost of her whisper still echoing in his ears. "I was the girl you left behind." He mechanically led Silas and the pack mule to the livery, his movements stiff and clumsy. He paid the stable boy, a skinny youth with curious eyes, and found a dark, empty stall in the back. The scent of hay and horses was a familiar comfort, but it couldn't penetrate the cold that had settled deep in his bones. He leaned against the rough-hewn wood, the world outside fading away as the past rose up to claim him, swift and merciless as a flash flood. He was a boy again, lying on his back in the tall grass by the Osage River in Missouri. The summer sun was warm on his face, and the air was thick with the smell of honeysuckle and damp earth. Beside him, Eliza Turner was tracing patterns in the clouds. Her laughter was the brightest sound in the world. They were 15, and the future was a boundless territory, a map they drew together in their minds. "We'll follow the Platte River," he'd said, his voice full of a boy's unshakable confidence. "All the way to the mountains. They say there are valleys so green you wouldn't believe, and creeks so full of beaver you can walk across their dams. And we'll build a cabin," she'd added, her blue eyes shining with the same fierce light as his, with a big stone fireplace and a porch to watch the sunset from. "No one will ever tell us what to do again." They were children of poverty, their dreams forged in the hardship of tenant farming. Their lives were a cycle of debt and toil, ruled by the seasons and the whims of the landowner. The West was their religion, a promised land of freedom and self-reliance. It was not just his dream, or her dream. It was their dream, a single, shared vision of a life they would build with their own two hands. He and his older brother, Daniel, would trap and hunt. She would plant a garden, keep chickens. They would be beholden to no one. But poverty has a way of strangling dreams. Daniel, always impatient, always looking for a shortcut, heard a story from some miners passing through. He learned of a trick for hunting, a fast, reckless way of using blasting powder to flush game from thickets or collapse burrows. Sam had been uneasy. It felt wrong, a violation of the patient code of the woodsman. But Daniel was his older brother, his hero, and Sam followed him as he always did. The memory came back not in pieces, but as a single, searing image. The crisp autumn air, the smell of sulfur and damp leaves, Daniel tamping the charge into a fissure in a rocky outcrop, laughing at Sam's nervousness. This'll save us a week of tracking. Little brother. Then the deafening roar. A sound that ripped the world apart. The flash of light, the spray of rock and dirt. When the ringing in Sam's ears subsided, there was only silence. A terrible, profound silence where Daniel's laughter had been. He found him by the shattered rocks, and the world Sam had known ended in that instant. The town did not need a judge or jury. Sam had been there. That was enough. Their grief needed a target, and he was the one left standing. The whispers started at the funeral, quiet and venomous, reckless. Always was the wild one. Led his brother to it. He saw the accusation in the eyes of his neighbors, felt it in the cold, averted gazes of his own parents, who were too lost in their own sea of sorrow to see his. The guilt was a physical thing, a sickness that soured his stomach and stole his breath. He was a pariah in the only home he had ever known. He had to run. There was no other choice. He packed a small bag in the dead of night, his movements frantic and quiet. He left a note for his parents, a few clumsy words of sorrow that could never be enough. Then he went to her. He'd tapped on Eliza's window, a secret signal from their childhood. She met him in the moonlight, her face pale with worry. He told her everything, the words tumbling out in a torrent of shame and fear. "I have to go. Lies," he'd choked out, the words tasting like ash. "They all look at me like I'm a killer." She hadn't cried. Her strength had always been a quiet, steady thing. She just held his hands, her small fingers gripping his tightly. "Where will you go?" "West," he'd whispered. It was the only answer he had. "Like we planned. I'll go first. I'll find the place. Our place. I'll make it safe. Then I'll come back for you. I swear it. Eliza, I'll come back." He had meant it. Every word. In the desperate heart of that scared, grieving boy, it had been a sacred vow. He saw himself as a pioneer, blazing a trail for their future. He didn't see himself for what he was, a coward, running from a ghost he could never outpace. Her kiss was chaste and sorrowful, a final, heartbreaking seal on their childhood. "Be safe. Sam," she had whispered against his cheek. "I'll be waiting." Leaning there in the darkness of the livery stable in Dust Creek, the memory was so vivid he could almost feel the cool press of her lips. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, so powerful it made him sick. For 12 years, he had buried that promise under a mountain of lonely days and silent nights. He had told himself it was for the best. He was a cursed man, marked by tragedy. Marrying him would have been dragging her into his darkness. He had convinced himself that she would eventually forget him, marry a decent farmer, and live a happy, simple life. It was a lie he had carefully constructed to make his own solitude bearable. Forgetting was a mercy he had wished upon her, because he could not bear the thought that she might have actually waited. But the look in her eyes today had torn that lie to shreds. She had not forgotten. And she had not married a decent farmer. She had married Thomas Carter, a man whose touch made her flinch, whose smile was as cold as a banker's heart. He had seen the cage she was in, a gilded prison of lace and wealth. Sam pushed himself off the wall and walked to the stable door, peering out into the swirling snow. The town was battening down for the storm. Lights glowed from windows, warm and yellow against the deepening twilight. Far down the street, he could just make out the church, its steeple a dark finger pointing at the heavy, gray sky. Through one of the tall, arched windows, he saw the faint, flickering lights of the altar candles, not yet extinguished. They seemed to waver in the wind, small, stubborn flames refusing to go out. Just like the memory he had tried so hard to kill. The first flakes of snow had been a novelty. Now they were a blinding curtain, a blizzard that swept down from the high peaks with a furious, mournful howl. The wind scoured the street, piling drifts against the buildings, burying the world in a shroud of white. It felt like the physical embodiment of his own soul, the years of buried guilt and silent regret swirling into a storm he could no longer control. He had come to Dust Creek for salt and ammunition, a simple transaction before returning to his self-imposed exile. But the past had ambushed him. It had a face and a name, and it was in trouble. He thought of his promise, made in the Missouri moonlight by a boy who believed in fresh starts. "I'll come back for you." He hadn't. He had run. But now, right here in the heart of the West they had dreamed of, she was waiting, not for a boy with promises, but for a man to finally keep one. The blizzard howled, and Sam knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the snow, that he could not ride away. Not this time. The blizzard lasted for 2 days, a white fury that sealed Dust Creek from the outside world. For Samuel Hawkins, it was a reprieve and a prison. The storm gave him an excuse to stay, to linger in the shadows of the livery stable, but it also trapped him with the ghost that had risen in the street. He spent the time tending to his horse and his thoughts, the two swirling together in a restless gray eddy. He saw her face in the patterns of frost on the stable window, heard her whisper in the shriek of the wind. The simple plan of melting back into the mountains was gone, buried under the snow along with the town's routines. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world of stunning, silent white. The sun was a pale wafer in a washed-out sky, and the town began to stir. Men digging out their storefronts and clearing paths with a communal grumble. Sam emerged from the livery into this changed landscape. The town felt smaller, more intimate and claustrophobic under its blanket of snow. Every movement was conspicuous, every footprint a declaration of presence. He was no longer an anonymous visitor. He was the stranger who had stopped the wedding procession, the mountain man who had shared a charged, silent moment with Thomas Carter's new bride. He felt the weight of curious eyes on him as he walked to the saloon. The saloon was the town's beating heart, and it was here he began to piece together the story. Men, thirsty from their shoveling, spoke more freely than they might have otherwise. The name Carter was on everyone's lips, spoken with a mixture of envy and fear. Sam sat in a dark corner, nursing a single whiskey, and listened. He learned that Carter had arrived 2 years prior with a fortune of mysterious origin, buying up the most promising mining claims, the timber rights to the whole valley, and the freight company. He had a hand in everything, and his influence reached all the way to the territorial capital. He also learned about Eliza. The story, as the saloon told it, was a sad, simple one. Her father, a merchant named Turner from back in Kansas, had overextended himself, borrowing heavily from Carter to finance a new venture that had failed. When Turner died suddenly from a fever, the debt fell to his only daughter, Carter. In a move the town saw as either magnanimous or shrewd, had forgiven the debt in exchange for her hand in marriage. Poor girl didn't have a choice. A grizzled miner muttered into his beer, "Marry the devil or lose everything." Some choice. The talk then turned to Carter's character. Men spoke of his temper, of business rivals who had been mysteriously ruined or driven out of the territory. They mentioned his crew of hired men, hard cases who acted as his personal enforcers and were billeted in a bunkhouse behind his large, new home on the edge of town. No one said anything directly, but the implications hung in the smoky air. Thomas Carter was a man who got what he wanted, and it was unwise to stand in his way. Sam left the saloon feeling a cold knot of dread in his stomach. This was worse than he had imagined. Eliza was not just in an unhappy marriage. She was owned, a piece of property acquired to settle a debt. The promise he had made to her as a boy, a promise of freedom and a life of their own making, seemed like a cruel joke in the face of this reality. Later that day, a message found him. It came by way of the stable boy, Joe, the same skinny youth from before. The boy approached him with the wide-eyed caution of someone handling a lit stick of dynamite, pressing a folded piece of paper into Sam's hand before scurrying away. The note was brief, the handwriting a familiar, elegant script that made his heart ache. The Dusty Spur Inn, back room, after sundown. It was unsigned. It didn't need to be. The Dusty Spur was a modest establishment, catering more to itinerant laborers than wealthy merchants. Its back room was a small, private parlor with a weak fire sputtering in the hearth. Sam was there first, pacing the creaking floorboards. His nerves stretched taut. When the door opened, he turned, and she was there. She was no longer the bride in white. She wore a simple, dark wool dress and had a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, as if she carried a permanent chill. The weariness he had seen in her eyes was even more pronounced up close. There were faint, bluish shadows beneath them. She closed the door quietly behind her, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other, the silence thick with 12 years of unsaid things. "Sam," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was dreaming." "Eliza," he breathed, the name feeling foreign and familiar on his tongue. I never thought I'd see you again." "You ran far," she said, a statement of fact, not an accusation. "Not far enough. It seems—" The guilt was a physical taste in his mouth. "Lies. What happened? Why are you here? Why him?" She came and sat in one of the worn chairs by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She told him the story the saloon gossip had only sketched out. She spoke of her father's last, desperate months, of his misplaced trust in Carter's promises of partnership. She described the crushing weight of the debt after his passing, the cold finality of the legal papers Carter had produced. "He came to me with a proposition," she said, her gaze fixed on the dying embers in the grate. "He said he would take care of everything. He would give me a home, security. All I had to do was become his wife." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "He made it sound like an act of charity. I was alone. Sam, I had nothing. It felt like I was drowning, and he was the only man offering a hand." Sam's fists clenched at his sides. He saw the trap for what it was. A spider's web spun of kindness and legal ink. He had left her vulnerable, and this man had taken advantage of it. And now Sam asked, his voice rough, Is he good to you?" She finally looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the unvarnished, terrifying truth. She didn't have to speak of specifics, of harsh words or a heavy hand. He saw the landscape of her fear, the constant, draining effort of navigating her husband's moods. "When he's sober, he is correct," she said, choosing her words with care. "He treats me like another one of his possessions, something valuable he acquired, to be displayed and polished. But when he drinks, the correctness falls away. He becomes another man. He reminds me of what I cost him. He reminds me that I belong to him." She paused, taking a shaky breath. Her gaze was steady, her voice low but clear, filled with a defiant fire he recognized from the girl she used to be. "He says he owns me, body and soul," she whispered, leaning forward slightly. "But the soul, that's still mine." The words struck Sam harder than any physical blow. In that moment, his own years of lonely self-pity seemed shameful and small. His guilt was a ghost haunting him. Her reality was a living nightmare. He had run from his past, while she had been forced to pay for the misfortunes of hers. "Why did you stay in Missouri?" he asked, the question tearing at him. "Why did you wait?" "I believed you," she said simply. "I believed you'd come back. For the first few years, I watched the road every day. After a while, I stopped watching. But I never stopped hoping. I guess a girl's hopes die hard." The simple, devastating honesty of it broke something inside him. All the justifications for his flight, all the lies he had told himself about her forgetting him for her own good. They all crumbled into dust. He had not spared her a thing. He had only abandoned her to a worse fate. He knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. "I'm sorry, Lies, for leaving, for everything." "It's too late for sorry. Sam," she said, though her fingers tightened on his, "you have to leave this town, now. Tonight. He saw the way you looked at me. He knows. He won't allow a challenge to what is his. He is a dangerous man. I'm not leaving you here." The words came out with a conviction that surprised him. The trapper who wanted only solitude was gone, replaced by the boy who had made a promise by the river. "You have to," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate urgency. "You don't know what he's capable of. I've seen things, heard things. Wagons that come and go in the middle of the night from the old warehouse by the creek. Men with guns who aren't miners or townsfolk. There's more to his fortune than mines and timber. Sam, it's a dark business. If you cross him, you'll end up disappearing like all the others who did." A cold clarity began to settle over Sam. Her fear was not just of a cruel husband, but of a ruthless criminal. The town was a powder keg. Carter was the fuse, and Sam's arrival was the spark. He could feel the tension in the air, could sense the unseen network of power and fear that Carter had woven around this small community. Even the law, in the form of Sheriff Boone, a man Sam had seen drinking at Carter's expense in the saloon, would be of no use. He had a choice. He could heed her warning, saddle his horse, and ride back to the safety of the mountains. He could disappear and save his own skin, leaving her to her fate. It was the same choice he had made 12 years ago. Or he could stay. He could stay and fight for the woman he had abandoned, for the memory of the boy he had been, for the last flickering ember of his own honor. He looked into her eyes, seeing the fear, but also the unbroken soul she spoke of. The decision was no decision at all. "I'm not running again. Eliza," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not this time." He rose to his feet as the innkeeper knocked on the door, a polite warning that their time was up. She stood as well, a new kind of fear in her eyes, now fear for him. She pulled her shawl tighter, becoming once again the respectable Mrs. Carter, as she slipped out the door and into the night. Sam knew the quiet part of his life was over. The wind had carried him down from the mountain for a reason. Dust Creek was no longer a simple stop for supplies. It was a place of reckoning. The days that followed their secret meeting were a quiet torment. Samuel felt as if he were holding his breath, waiting for a storm that had already gathered on the horizon. He stayed in town, a silent, watchful presence, his trapper's instincts now trained on the movements of men instead of beasts. He saw the way Thomas Carter's hired men watched him, their gazes flat and hostile. He saw the way the townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their curiosity now tinged with fear. He was a disruption, an unknown quantity in the town's carefully balanced ecosystem of power and compliance, and no one knew what to do with him. He saw Eliza only once, from a distance. She was in a carriage with her husband, sitting ramrod straight, a veil hiding her face. There was a stiffness in her posture that spoke volumes, a fragility that made Sam's hands ache to do something, to break something. He was a man of action, and this waiting felt like a kind of poison, slowly seeping into his blood. The rumor started 3 days after their meeting, a seed of malice planted in the fertile soil of the town's gossip. It began with the doctor, a quiet, kind man named Quinn, being seen leaving the Carter house at an odd hour. Then a housemaid, sent to the general store for liniment and bandages, was overheard speaking in hushed, frightened tones to the storekeeper's wife. The whispers multiplied, spreading from the saloon to the smithy, from the church sewing circle to the muddy street. Sam heard the definitive version from the stable boy, Joe, whose job gave him access to the town's unfiltered talk. The boy found Sam cleaning his rifle in the livery, his young face pale with a mixture of fear and morbid excitement. "They're saying Mr. Carter found something," Joe whispered, glancing nervously toward the stable door. "A letter. An old one. They're saying he and the missus had a row. A bad one." The boy swallowed hard. "They're saying she took a fall down the stairs." A fall. The euphemism was so thin it was transparent. Sam looked at the clean oiled metal of his rifle, at the deadly precision of its mechanism. An anger, cold and pure, settled over him. It was the same helpless rage he had felt when he found his brother's broken body, a feeling that the world was fundamentally unjust and that he was powerless to set it right. But he was not a boy anymore, and he was not powerless. That night, The snow began to fall again. It came not as a blizzard this time, but as a steady, silent descent, each flake a whisper of absolution, covering the town's ugliness in a blanket of pristine white. For Sam, it was a sign. The snow was a cloak, a gift from the mountains. It would muffle his footsteps and hide him from watchful eyes. The time for waiting was over. He left the livery after midnight, moving through the deserted streets like a phantom. The Carter house stood on a rise at the edge of town, a large two-story structure that was more a monument to wealth than a home. Its windows were dark, save for a single lamp burning in a downstairs parlor. It looked like a slumbering beast, its dark secrets held close within its timbered walls. Sam didn't go to the house itself. He circled around to the back, toward the warehouse Eliza had mentioned, using the skills honed over years of tracking wary prey. He moved with impossible quietness, the falling snow covering his tracks almost as soon as he made them. The warehouse was a long, low building, its windows boarded up. A thick padlock was on the main door. He found a rear shutter that was loose, and with the patient application of his hunting knife, he pried it open and slipped inside. The air was thick with the smell of raw whiskey, cured tobacco, and something else, the metallic tang of unminted gold, in the faint light from the cracks in the walls. He saw crates stacked to the rafters. Many were stamped with the names of mining companies that had mysteriously gone bust. Eliza had been right. This was the source of Carter's power, a dark enterprise of stolen goods and smuggled wealth. He was about to leave when he heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside. He pressed himself into the shadows as a key scraped in the padlock. The door creaked open, and one of Carter's men entered, carrying a lantern. The man was there to check on the goods. A routine patrol. Sam held his breath, every muscle tensed. He could wait for the man to leave. But then, through the open door, he heard a sound from the main house, a faint, desperate sob, quickly muffled. It was the only sound he needed to hear. All thought of stealth, of careful planning, vanished. He moved from the shadows, a silent wraith. The guard turned, his eyes widening in surprise, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. Sam was faster. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a single, brutal blow. The guard crumpled to the floor, unconscious. But in the struggle, his lantern dropped from his hand, rolled across the floorboards. The glass shattered, and the flame leaped from the wick, greedily tasting the whiskey that had leaked from a nearby crate. A small tongue of blue fire flickered to life. Sam had only seconds. He glanced at the growing flame, then toward the house. There was no choice to be made. He left the guard where he lay and ran from the warehouse, not back into the cover of the woods, but directly toward the cold, dark house. He found a side door unlocked, likely for the guard's use. The house was silent and opulent, filled with heavy furniture and thick carpets that felt alien beneath his worn moccasins. He moved from room to room, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found her on the 2nd floor. She was in a small guest bedroom at the end of the hall, the door locked from the outside. He didn't hesitate. He put his shoulder to the door and slammed his weight against it. The wood splintered, the lock gave way, and the door flew open. She was huddled on the floor in the corner, wrapped in a thin blanket. Her face was pale in the moonlight slanting through the window, and he could see a dark, ugly bruise beginning to blossom on her cheek. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. For a moment, she looked like she might scream. "Sam," she breathed, her voice a raw, broken thing. "I'm here?" "Lies," he said softly, crossing the room and kneeling beside her. "I'm getting you out." He helped her to her feet. She was trembling, leaning on him for support. As they moved into the hallway, a flickering orange light began to dance through the windows. A low roar, like the sound of a great beast awakening, started to build outside. The fire, it had taken hold. They were halfway down the grand staircase when the front door burst open. Thomas Carter stood there, his face contorted with rage. Behind him, two of his hired men stood ready. Carter's eyes went from Sam to Eliza, who was clinging to Sam's arm, and his face became a mask of pure fury. "You!" Carter snarled, his voice dripping with venom as he took a step forward. "You will not take what is mine." Before he could take another step, the town's fire bell began to clang. A frantic, desperate alarm in the snowy night. Shouts echoed from the street. The orange glow outside intensified, painting the walls of the foyer in a hellish light. The fire was no longer a secret. It was a beacon, a roaring testament to the corruption hidden in the heart of Dust Creek. Carter and his men were momentarily distracted, their heads turning toward the growing commotion. It was the only opening Sam needed. He pulled Eliza toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen and the servants' exit. They burst out into the night air just as the warehouse roof collapsed with a deafening roar, sending a fountain of embers spiraling into the falling snow. The entire town seemed to be pouring into the street, their faces illuminated by the inferno. The warehouse was a churning mass of flame, the snow around it melting and turning to steam. Sam stood with Eliza behind the cordon of onlookers, his arm protectively around her shoulders. She was shaking, but her eyes were fixed on the fire, a strange, transfixed expression on her face, as if she were watching her prison burn to the ground. Carter appeared, bellowing orders, trying to organize a bucket brigade, trying to maintain control, but it was too late. His authority was burning away with his stolen fortune. He saw Sam and Eliza standing together, and his composure finally snapped. He strode toward them, his face a mask of hate. "This is your doing, you mountain savage," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Sam. "And you," he spat, turning to Eliza, "you will pay for this." Just as he lunged for her, a firm hand grabbed his arm. Sheriff Boone, his face grim in the firelight, stood between them. For once, the sheriff was not looking at Carter with his usual deference. He was looking at the bruise on Eliza's face, at the splintered door of his house, at the inferno that had been a warehouse full of secrets. The whole town was watching. "That's enough, Carter," Boone said, his voice quiet but carrying an unaccustomed weight of authority. "There's been enough trouble for one night. You're coming with me." Carter stared, dumbfounded. "You can't be serious. He broke into my home. He assaulted my wife." "Right now," the sheriff said, his grip tightening, "all I see is a fire that started on your property, and a lady who looks like she needs a doctor, not a husband. We'll sort it out in the morning." He and his deputy led a sputtering, protesting Thomas Carter away. The townsfolk stared, their whispers now a loud buzz. They looked from the fire to Eliza, her reputation now in ashes, then to Sam, the catalyst, the outsider who had brought the town's simmering secrets to a violent, fiery boil. He held Eliza closer as she began to weep, not from fear, but from a profound, shattering release. The fire burned on, melting the snow around it, a symbol of a terrible truth finally brought to light, a cleansing flame in the heart of the cold, silent winter. The dawn that followed the fire was unnaturally quiet. The sky was a bruised purple, and the air was sharp with the acrid smell of wet, charred timber. The warehouse was a blackened skeleton, a gaping wound in the town's neat white blanket of snow. Dust Creek held its collective breath, waiting to see what the new day would bring. Justice, it turned out, was a commodity that could be bought and sold like any other. By mid-morning, Thomas Carter was released from the town's small jail. A lawyer, summoned by telegraph from a larger city down the line, had arrived on a special train, bringing with him a satchel full of legal documents and an aura of expensive, unassailable authority. He and Carter met with Sheriff Boone in his office for less than an hour. The result was a foregone conclusion. Boone found Samuel by the livery, where he was checking on his horse. The sheriff looked older than he had the night before. his face drawn and weary. He didn't meet Sam's eye. "He's out," Boone said, his voice flat. "He kicked at a chunk of dirty ice. His lawyer says he's pressing charges, breaking and entering, arson, assaulting one of his men." "And what about Eliza?" Sam asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What about the bruise on her face and the locked door? Did the lawyer explain those away too?" "The lawyer," Boone said, finally looking up, his eyes full of a tired resignation, "says Mrs. Carter is overwrought, prone to hysterics, that she fell and, in her confusion, locked herself in the room. He has a sworn statement from the housemaid to that effect." He sighed, a plume of white vapor in the cold air. "Look, Hawkins, I'm not a fool. I know what I saw last night. But this town, it runs on Carter's coin. The circuit judge plays cards with him. The territorial delegate is in his pocket. There's no law here that's bigger than his money." He paused, letting the bitter truth of it settle between them. "So here's the way it is. Carter has agreed to drop the charges against you on one condition: you are to be out of my jurisdiction by sundown. If you're seen here after that, I have a warrant for your arrest." "You're banishing me," Sam stated, a cold anger coiling in his gut. "You're throwing me out so he can have his way." "I'm saving your life, son," Boone corrected, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You can't win this fight. Not here, not now. If you stay, you'll end up in a federal prison, or more likely, in a shallow grave out in the woods. Is that what she would want?" The sheriff's words were a bitter pill, but Sam knew they were true. He was a man with nothing but a rifle and a horse against an empire of wealth and influence. He was a force of nature, but Carter was a force of civilization, and civilization had laws designed to protect its own. Meanwhile, Eliza found herself in a prison without walls. She had refused to return to Carter's house, and Dr. Quinn, in a quiet act of defiance, had given her a room in his own small home adjacent to his clinic. But the town itself had turned on her. Society in the West had rigid, unwritten rules, and the most sacred of these was the sanctity of a man's home and his authority over his wife. For a woman to speak out against her husband, especially a man as powerful as Carter, was not just a scandal. It was an act of madness. The whispers followed her like a shadow. When she dared to walk to the general store for a few necessities, women would cross the street to avoid her, gathering in tight knots to watch her pass, their face masks of condemnation. Hysterical, she must have provoked him to bring such shame on her husband, and with that wild mountain man. Of all people, her reputation, already fragile, was now in tatters. She was an outcast, isolated by the very community she was supposed to be a part of. She had been saved from a locked room only to be locked out of the world. Sam made a show of leaving. He packed his mule, paid his bill at the livery, and rode west out of town just as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the snow-laden peaks. He saw the curtains twitch in windows as he passed, felt the collective sigh of relief as the troublemaker finally departed. But he did not go far. Once he was out of sight of the town, he veered north into the thick pine and aspen forest that bordered the valley. He found a secluded hollow, sheltered from the wind, with a clear view of the lights of Dust Creek below. He made a cold camp, built a small, smokeless fire, and settled in to watch and to wait. He had run from his past once. He would not run from her future. 2 nights passed. The cold was a living thing, seeping into his bones, but it was a familiar companion. He was more at home here, in the silent, watchful woods, than he had ever been in the noisy, judgmental town. On the 3rd night, as a sliver of moon rose over the valley, he saw a lone figure making its way from the edge of town, moving hesitantly toward the forest. He doused his fire and waited in the darkness, his rifle in his hands. The figure drew closer, moving with a determined but unpracticed gait through the deep snow. It was a woman, wrapped in a heavy cloak. It was Eliza. She found him by the faint scent of wood smoke and the quiet patience of his stillness. When he stepped out from behind a snow-heavy pine, she gave a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Sam," she breathed, relief and fear warring in her voice. "I was so afraid you had gone." "I told you I wasn't running again," he said softly. He took the bundle she was carrying. It was heavy, wrapped in a blanket. "You shouldn't have come. It's too dangerous." "It was more dangerous to stay," she replied. "Doctor, Quinn is a good man, but he can't protect me forever. Carter is waiting. He's letting the town condemn me first, so that when he comes to take me back, they will see it as a husband reclaiming his rightful, if wayward, property." He led her to his camp, a small hollow shielded by a granite outcrop. He reignited the fire, the small flames pushing back the immense darkness of the forest. He unwrapped the bundle she had brought: a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, a bottle of wine, and another thick wool blanket. It was a feast. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind in the pines. There were no words for the chasm that had separated them, or for the fragile bridge they were now building across it. The shared meal, the shared warmth of the small fire, was a communion more profound than any spoken sentiment. When they had finished, she looked at him, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. He had taken off his heavy outer coat to tend the fire, and in the flickering light, her gaze fell upon his shoulder, there, on the weathered deerskin of his shirt. The fabric was worn thin over a patch of raised, whitened skin. The scar, the one the grizzly had given him all those years ago, in the moment that had cost his brother his life. It was the mark of his shame, the physical manifestation of the guilt that had driven him into exile. She reached out, her fingers hesitant at first, then firm, and traced the rugged outline of the scar through his shirt. It was not a gesture of pity, nor one of passion. It was an act of quiet, radical acceptance. Her touch was not on his skin, but on his history, on the deepest, most painful part of his soul. She was acknowledging the wound that had defined him, the ghost he had been running from, and she was not turning away. He sat perfectly still, a lifetime of guarded loneliness breached by this one simple touch. He had always thought of the scar as something ugly, something to be hidden, but under her gentle fingers, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a story, a part of him that she was willing to read and understand. He looked at her, at the bruise on her cheek, a wound far fresher and more cruel than his own. They were two broken people, their lives scarred by tragedy and the cruelty of others. The cold of the forest pressed in around them, but in the small circle of firelight, something warm was beginning to grow. He had left her behind once, a boy running from a ghost, but now, a man marked by that same ghost. He knew he would never leave her again. The law of men had cast them both out, but here, under the silent watch of the ancient mountains, they were beginning to find a law of their own. The quiet intimacy of their camp in the woods lasted for a single, stolen day. For the first time in 12 years, Samuel Hawkins felt the hard knot of guilt in his chest begin to loosen. He watched Eliza as she moved about the small camp, her presence a balm on his solitary soul. They spoke of the future, their words careful and quiet, sketching out a plan to head north, toward the wild. Empty lands of Montana where a man like Carter could not reach them. It was a fragile dream, but it was theirs, a continuation of the one they'd had as children by the river. The dream was shattered the next morning. Eliza, practical and determined, insisted on returning to town one last time. She needed to retrieve a small satchel of personal belongings she had left with Dr. Quinn, and more importantly, to thank him properly for his kindness. Sam was against it, a hunter's instinct screaming that the trap had not yet been sprung. "I'll be quick, Sam," she argued, her chin set with that familiar stubbornness. "I can't just vanish. He deserves to know I am safe and that I am grateful. I'll be back before noon." He relented, against his better judgment. He watched her disappear into the tree line, a small, resolute figure moving from the wild back toward the world of men. He spent the morning restlessly cleaning his weapons, his ears straining for the sound of her return. Noon came and went. The sun climbed higher, and a cold dread began to seep into Sam's bones. By mid-afternoon, he could wait no longer. He moved to the edge of the forest, his body shielded by the trees, his eyes scanning the town, and he saw it. A crowd was gathered in the main street. In their midst, a freight wagon stood, and beside it, Thomas Carter sat calmly on his horse, looking for all the world like a king surveying his domain. Tied to the wagon seat, her hands bound before her, was Eliza. Sam's blood ran cold. He had let her walk right into it. Carter hadn't needed to hunt him in the woods. He had simply waited for his bait to return. As Sam watched, paralyzed by a mixture of fury and self-loathing, he saw the stable boy, Joe, being pushed forward by one of Carter's men. The boy, his face as white as the snow, scurried across the street and tacked a piece of paper to the door of the livery stable before running back to the safety of the crowd. It was a message. It was for him. He had to get closer. He slipped back into the woods, circling the town until he could approach the livery from the rear. He waited for a moment when the crowd's attention was fixed on Carter, then darted across the open space, tore the note from the door, and retreated into the shadows of an alleyway. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. Carter's handwriting was a bold, arrogant scrawl. "Mountain Man." It read, "You have taken what is mine. If you want her back, meet me on Main Street, tomorrow, at high noon. Come alone, or she will pay the price for your cowardice." The world narrowed to those few, cruel words. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a death sentence, delivered on a public stage. Carter didn't just want him dead. He wanted him humiliated. He wanted to prove to the entire town that no one, not even a ghost from the mountains, could defy him. Sam looked back toward the street. He saw Eliza, her head held high, her gaze sweeping the rooftops and alleyways, searching for him, even as a prisoner. She was defiant. She was not beaten, and he would not fail her again. The night was the longest of his life. He returned to the cold, empty camp, the silence now a tormenting accusation. He did not sleep. He sat by the dying embers of his fire, his rifle across his lap, and prepared himself. He was not a duelist. He had never faced a man down in a dusty street. He was a hunter. His skills were in patience, in observation, in the single, perfectly placed shot that meant the difference between a full belly and a hungry winter. He would have to treat this not as a gunfight, but as the most dangerous hunt of his life. The prey was a man, and the prize was everything. The sun rose the next day into a clear, mercilessly bright sky. It warmed the air, and the snow began to melt, the steady drip, drip, drip from the pines sounding like the ticking of a clock. At 1:45, Samuel Hawkins stepped out of the forest and began to walk toward Dust Creek. He carried only his rifle and the pistol at his hip. His face was a grim, unreadable mask. As he entered the town, a strange silence fell. The usual noise of the smithy's hammer and the rumble of wagon wheels ceased. Doors closed. Shutters were drawn. Faces appeared in windows, then quickly vanished. The town was holding its breath, transforming itself into an amphitheater for the coming violence. Main Street, usually a river of mud and commerce, was empty, utterly empty. At the far end, Thomas Carter was waiting. He was dressed in black, a stark figure against the white snow. His men, a half-dozen of them, were positioned on the boardwalks and in the doorways of the saloon, their presence a silent promise of overwhelming force. Behind Carter stood the wagon. Eliza was there, just as she had been the day before, tied to the seat. She was his shield and his trophy. Sam walked steadily down the center of the street, his boots making soft sounds in the melting slush. The sun was directly overhead, a searing white eye that bleached all the color from the world. There was no wind. The air was perfectly still, so quiet he could hear the frantic beat of his own heart. He stopped 50 yards from Carter, the traditional dueling distance. The space between them felt like a mile, a dead man's land shimmering in the heat rising from the damp ground. "So the savage crawls out of his hole," Carter called out, his voice echoing in the unnatural silence. He smiled, a confident, predatory baring of teeth. "Come to reclaim your lost property. You're too late. She belongs to me. This town belongs to me. Everything the light touches here is mine." Sam didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on Carter, but his hunter's senses were taking in everything else. The position of Carter's men, the way the sun glinted off a window pane, the nervous twitch of a horse tied to a hitching post. He saw Eliza strain against her bonds, her eyes wide, pleading with him. "Let her go, Carter," Sam said, his voice quiet, yet it carried with the clear, cold authority of a death sentence. Carter laughed. "You are in no position to make demands. You are a ghost, a relic. I am the future. After I kill you, I'll take my wife home, and we will forget you ever existed." He slowly, deliberately, moved his hand until it hovered over the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. It's high noon. The world seemed to stop. The dripping of the melting snow ceased. The sun beat down. The silence stretched thin, ready to snap. Sam did not look at Carter's hand. He looked at his eyes. In the wild, you never watch the claws, you watch the eyes. They told you everything. He saw the flicker of pride, the tightening of the jaw, the infinitesimal shift of weight as Carter prepared to draw. It happened in a single, fluid explosion of motion. Carter's hand blurred as it dropped to his gun. But Sam didn't draw. He was a hunter, not a gunslinger. His rifle was already in his hands. In the same instant, Carter's pistol began to clear its holster. Sam raised the rifle to his shoulder, aimed, and fired. 2 shots cracked the silence. So close together they sounded like one. A red flower bloomed on Carter's chest. His eyes widened in stunned surprise, his shot going wide, splintering the sign of the general store. He staggered backward, a look of profound disbelief on his face, as if he could not comprehend that his world of money and power had been undone by a single piece of lead. He fell to his knees, and then pitched forward into the mud. Still, at the same moment, Sam felt a fiery hammer blow to his side. One of Carter's men, from the saloon doorway, had fired. The force of the bullet spun him around, and a wave of searing pain washed over him. He dropped to one knee, his rifle clattering to the ground. The world swam in a haze of red. But through it, he could see Carter's men raising their own rifles, ready to finish him. "Hold your fire." The voice was a roar. Sheriff Boone stepped out from his office, a shotgun held steady in his hands. He was no longer the tired, defeated man. His face was set like granite. "It's over," he declared to the street. "This was a fair fight. It's done." Carter's men hesitated, looking from their fallen leader to the sheriff's determined face and the double barrels of his shotgun. One by one, they slowly lowered their weapons. The reckoning was complete. The town's brutal king was dead. Through a fog of pain, Sam pushed himself to his feet. Every instinct screamed at him to fall, but he would not. He stumbled forward, his eyes locked on Eliza. He reached the wagon, pulled his hunting knife, and with a shaking hand, sawed through the ropes that bound her. She was free. She threw her arms around his neck, her sobs lost in the fabric of his shirt. He held her for a moment, the scent of her hair filling his senses, a moment of impossible victory. Then his strength gave out. The world went black at the edges, and he collapsed into the melting snow. Her name, a last, desperate whisper on his lips. Samuel awoke to a world of white ceiling, white sheets, a blinding white pain in his side. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was back in a snowdrift, the life bleeding out of him. Then a familiar scent cut through the haze, carbolic acid and boiled linens. He was in a clinic. A face swam into view, gentle and lined with concern. Dr. Quinn. "Well now, look who decided to rejoin the living," the doctor said, his voice a soft rumble. "You had us worried. Son, the bullet passed clean through, but it took a piece of you with it. You'll be weak for a while." Sam tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. A single, croaked word came out. "Eliza." "Right here." Her voice came from his other side. He turned his head, a monumental effort, and there she was. She was sitting in a chair pulled close to his cot, her face pale and her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But she was there. She was safe. He felt the tension that had been coiled in his gut for days finally, blessedly. Release. He closed his eyes and let the darkness take him again. But this time, it was a peaceful, healing dark. He spent the next week drifting in and out of consciousness in the small back room of Dr. Quinn's clinic. During his lucid moments, he learned what had happened. Sheriff Boone, in his one great act of definitive justice, had declared the gunfight a matter of self-defense. Carter's men, leaderless and suddenly faced with a lawman who had found his spine, had quietly packed their things and ridden out of town by nightfall. Carter's empire, built on fear and a foundation of stolen gold, had crumbled the moment its king had fallen. But the town's verdict on Eliza was more complicated. She became a figure of whispered legend. Sam heard it in the low tones of the women who came to the clinic, their voices drifting through the thin walls. They no longer spoke of her with condemnation. The public brutality of the duel, the sight of her tied and helpless, had shattered the illusion of Carter's respectability. Now, they spoke of her with a kind of awed, fearful respect. She was the woman who chose love over gold, a phrase that was part admiration and part cautionary tale. She had defied the rules and won, but she was still marked by the defiance, still an outsider. Eliza was his constant shadow. She changed his bandages, her touch gentle and sure. She spoon-fed him broth, coaxing him to eat when all he wanted was to sleep. She read to him from a tattered book of poems she'd found on the doctor's shelf. He watched her, his heart aching with a love so profound it was a physical pain, almost as sharp as the one in his side. He saw the strength in her, a deep, resilient core that had not bent or broken, despite everything. She had been waiting for a boy to come back and rescue her, but in the end, she had found the strength to rescue herself. He had just been the weapon she needed. After 2 weeks, Dr. Quinn declared him well enough to move, but not well enough to travel far. "You can't stay here," the doctor said, looking from Sam to Eliza. "The town is quiet for now, but memory is a fickle thing. Carter had friends, business partners. It's not safe. You need to disappear for a while. Let this all settle into history." Sam knew a place, a small line cabin he had used during his first winters in the high country. It was nestled in a hidden valley, by a creek that ran clean and cold all year round. It was remote, defensible, and a world away from Dust Creek. Getting there was an ordeal. Sheriff Boone, in a final act of complicity, provided a wagon and a horse. Looking the other way as Sam, leaning heavily on Eliza, climbed aboard under the cover of a moonless night. The journey into the foothills was slow and agonizing, every jolt of the wagon sending a fresh wave of fire through Sam's side. Eliza drove, her hands steady on the reins, her gaze fixed on the dark trail ahead. The cabin was exactly as he had left it, small, sturdy, and smelling of pine and wood smoke. It was a single room, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a built-in bunk. For the first time, seeing it through her eyes, he realized how stark and lonely it was. But when Eliza lit a lamp, its golden light filled the small space, and as she began to unpack the supplies they had brought, it started to feel less like a hermit's refuge and more like a home. There, in the quiet solitude of the mountains, the real healing began. As Sam's body slowly knit itself back together, So did their spirits. The days fell into a simple, peaceful rhythm. Eliza would tend to his wound, her movements becoming practiced and efficient. He would watch her, learning the lines of her face again, the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, the sound of her quiet hum as she tidied the cabin. They talked for hours, their conversations bridging the 12-year gap between them. He told her about the mountains, about the silence and the solitude, and for the first time, he spoke of Daniel, of the accident, of the guilt that had been his constant companion. He spoke of it not as an excuse for running, but as a simple, painful truth. She listened, her hand resting on his, her presence a silent absolution. She, in turn, told him of her years of waiting, of the slow, painful death of her hope, and of the suffocating emptiness of her life with Carter. She spoke of it without bitterness, like a traveler describing a long, hard road she had been forced to walk. By sharing their stories, they began to empty the poison of the past, letting the clean mountain air wash it away. One afternoon, when he was strong enough to walk, they went down to the creek that ran beside the cabin. The water was shockingly cold, tumbling over smooth gray stones. It sounded a constant, cleansing murmur. They sat on the bank, not speaking, just listening to the song of the water. It felt like a baptism, a washing away of the blood and grime of Dust Creek, of the dust and sorrow of Missouri. It was the sound of a new beginning. "I used to dream of a place like this," she said softly, her eyes on the swirling currents. "When I was a girl, a place where the world couldn't touch us." "It was my dream too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was always our dream. Lies." He knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that they could not stay here. This cabin, this valley, was a sanctuary. But it was still tied to his past, to the lonely man he had been. Dust Creek lay just over the ridge, a reminder of the life they were leaving behind. Their dream had never been about hiding. It had been about building. That evening, as the setting sun painted the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, he stood with her on the small porch of the cabin. He was still weak, but he stood tall, his arm around her shoulders. "When I'm strong enough to ride," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "we should go." She didn't ask where. She didn't need to. She just leaned her head against his shoulder. "North," she asked. "North," he confirmed. "To Montana. There's country up there no one's ever seen. Enough mountains and forests to get lost in forever. We can find a new valley, build a new cabin. Our cabin." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the twilight. The last of the town's whispers and judgments, the last of Carter's shadows, seemed to fall away from her. She was no longer a bride or a widow, a victim or a legend. She was just Eliza, and he was just Sam. The morning light that would come tomorrow would be the first of their new life, a shared dawn over a land of their own choosing. "Yes," she whispered, a smile finally, truly reaching her eyes. "Let's go home." Time has a way of turning fact into folklore, especially in a land as vast and new as the American West. The story of what happened in Dust Creek was no exception. It passed from the mouths of prospectors to the ears of saloon keepers, from the letters of a circuit preacher to the gossip of a railroad surveyor. With each telling, the tale grew, shedding the messy, painful details and taking on the smooth, hard shape of a legend. They stopped calling them Samuel Hawkins and Eliza Carter. In the story, they became simply the mountain man and his bride. He was a spirit of the high peaks, a man who spoke the language of the wind and the snow, summoned from his solitude by an injustice he could not abide. She was a woman of impossible beauty and unbreakable will, a lady from the East who had the heart of a pioneer, trapped in the gilded cage of a ruthless gold baron. The fire that consumed the warehouse became a cleansing flame of righteousness, and the gunfight in the street was no longer a desperate, bloody affair, but a mythic duel between the old, wild heart of the frontier and the new, corrupt ambition of civilization. The story became a part of the landscape, a cautionary tale for the greedy and an inspiration for the hopeful. It was a reminder that even in the lawless corners of the world, there was a different kind of law, a deeper justice that could not be bought or buried. But legends are only the bones of a story. The flesh and blood of it, the true heart of it, was simpler, quieter, and lived hundreds of miles north, in a valley in Montana so remote it was not yet on any map. 15 years had passed. The snow was falling outside, thick and silent, piling in soft drifts against the windows of a sturdy log cabin that sat by a bend in a river. Inside, a fire crackled in a large stone hearth, the same one they had dreamed of as children. The room was filled with the scent of baking bread, pine smoke, and drying herbs. It was a small space, but it held a whole world. Samuel Hawkins came in from the cold, his shoulders dusted with snow. The years had been kind to him. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, settled peace. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, and gray now touched his temples, but he moved with the same quiet, powerful grace he always had. He stamped the snow from his boots and hung his heavy coat on a peg by the door. Eliza was kneading dough on a flowered wooden table, her back to him. She had aged too, the years etching fine lines around her eyes, but they were lines of laughter and contentment, not sorrow. Her hands, which had once been the soft hands of a merchant's daughter, were now strong and capable, yet they moved with an innate elegance. She was humming a soft, tuneless song, a sound that was as much a part of the cabin's warmth as the fire itself. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder, inhaling the scent of flower and woman and home. She leaned back against him, her hands stilling in the dough. They stood like that for a long moment, watching the snow fall outside the window. Two people so entwined they seemed to breathe as one. The world of Dust Creek, of Thomas Carter, of the ghosts of Missouri, was a lifetime away, a story that belonged to someone else. "The snow is settling in deep," he murmured into her hair. "Looks like we won't be seeing any visitors for a while." "Good," she said simply. "I have all the company I need right here." He smiled, his heart full. He had spent so many years believing he was destined for solitude, a man cursed to live with his guilt in the silence of the mountains. He had thought that silence was freedom, but he had been wrong. True freedom was not the absence of people. It was the presence of the one person who saw you, all of you, and chose to stay. She turned in his arms to face him, wiping a smear of flour from his cheek with her thumb. Her eyes, still as blue as a mountain lake, sparkled in the firelight. She looked at him with a playful, knowing smile, a smile that held 15 years of shared sunrises, of hardships overcome and joys discovered. "You don't remember me, do you, mountain man?" she whispered, her voice a soft, loving tease. The words, which had once been a bridge of sorrow across a chasm of years, were now a sweet, familiar melody. They were a reminder of the impossible beginning that had led to this perfect, simple peace. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that rumbled in his chest. He pulled her closer, until there was no space left between them at all, and pressed his forehead against hers. "I remember you," he said, his voice thick with a love that time had only deepened. "You're my home." And in that small cabin, as the snow fell and blanketed the vast, wild land in a profound and peaceful silence, the legend was made real. The truth of the West was not written in the histories of gold rushes or railroad barons, but in the quiet courage of two souls who had been broken by the world and had found a way to heal each other. They had discovered that justice was not always found in a sheriff's office or at the end of a gun, but in the fierce, unwavering loyalty of a loving heart. They had learned that a person could indeed find their humanity in the heart of the wilderness, not by conquering it, but by building a life within it, a life of decency and peace, a life where the past was not a ghost to be fled, but a story to be remembered, a story of a love that had refused to die. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help others find this tale.